What is the correct way to understand the Type 100 armored vehicle family? Today, let's have a brief discussion on this topic. Tonight, we will mainly focus on the Type 100 armored vehicle family. Originally, I didn't really want to talk about this because I don't pay much attention to tanks themselves, and the tank I am most familiar with is probably the German Tiger tank from World War II. However, recently, whether on Bilibili or YouTube, I have seen many misunderstandings about our 4th generation armored vehicle family. When people talk about the 4th generation armored vehicle family, most of them focus on its active protection systems and the optoelectronic equipment installed on it. Some even wonder if the device on the Type 100 support vehicle is a radar. People pay more attention to these aspects. For example, some people in a certain place in Fujian even think that the so-called Type 100 tank is also a medium-sized combat vehicle that cooperates with the Type 99 tank. During the 93 military parade this time, it was used in coordination with the Type 99 tank. Moreover, many people believe that compared with previous tanks, the Type 100 tank is more suitable for future urban combat. Actually, I'm not that familiar with tanks, but I went to watch the rehearsal before the 93 military parade, and during the rehearsal, I had some communication with personnel from Norinco Group. In fact, the actual use of the entire Type 100 armored vehicle family is completely contrary to what most people think on the internet. The Type 100 armored vehicle family was not launched because of the Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, this project has a long history. It started around 2012, in the early 2010s. It's just that we are now seeing its achievements today. Originally, the Type 100 tank had an early 4th generation version, and even that early 4th generation version was not designed for the so-called armor-piercing projectile confrontation that people imagine. As early as the 2000s, around 2008 and 2009, domestic armor designers had already said that if in the next generation of warfare, enemy tanks still appear in the gun sight, then the war is lost. In fact, the entire Type 100 armored vehicle family is completely based on our design concept for the next generation of land warfare at that time. Today, let's briefly talk about the Type 100 tank. When we compare the Type 100 tank with the previous Type 99 tank, the biggest actual difference is not the active protection system. After all, the Type 99 tank can also be equipped with an active protection system. Even Russia's T-90 can be equipped with one, which is just installing 4-sided phased arrays, or whether more sensors can be installed on it. In fact, none of these are the key differences. The essential difference lies in their design concepts. First, as we can clearly see from this picture, both the Type 100 tank and the armored support vehicle displayed this time have two very thick antennas, unlike the Type 99 tank, which has one thick and one thin antenna. Therefore, there is a great difference in their design concepts. In fact, the Type 100 tank no longer focuses much on armor-piercing projectile confrontation. Some people also say that the Type 100 tank is a two-man tank, but in fact, we can clearly see from the periscopes at the front of the vehicle body that there are actually 3 sets of periscopes. Therefore, the Type 100 tank is a 3-man tank. In the old 4th generation tanks, there was such a 2-man configuration, but the Type 100 tank adopts a 3-man crew configuration. In fact, the 3rd crew member is also very different from that in the Type 99 tank. We know that the 3 crew members of the Type 99 tank are a driver, a commander, and a gunner. In the Type 100 tank, the position of the gunner is mainly eliminated, and instead, a crew member who is better at perception and observation is added. Although we can see that the Type 100 tank is equipped with VR glasses, it is not a big problem to install such equipment on the Type 99 tank. Many people also criticize the Type 100 tank for using a 105mm gun instead of a 125mm or even larger caliber gun. In fact, as mentioned earlier, the entire 4th generation armored vehicle family does not focus on armor-piercing projectile confrontation. Such equipment no longer undertakes the task of frontline combat and close combat with the enemy. Compared with the previous 125mm gun, the biggest advantage of adopting the 105mm gun is that it has switched back to a rifled gun. We know that traditional curved fire artillery and suppression artillery are all rifled. The biggest advantage of the 105mm rifled gun is that when conducting long-range strikes, its shells are more accurate than those of smoothbore guns. Because compared with rifled guns, smoothbore guns have no rifling, and their advantage lies in higher muzzle velocity. Due to the need for armor-piercing projectile confrontation, the maximum strike range of traditional tanks is only 3 kilometers. However, because the Type 100 tank adopts a rifled gun and has a higher elevation angle of the gun barrel, its strike range can reach 8 to 10 kilometers. Basically, we all know that on land, it is almost impossible to see targets beyond 8 kilometers with optical equipment or the naked eye. For targets beyond 8 kilometers, you have to rely on other equipment in the entire unit to observe for you, such as drone swarms, forward reconnaissance unmanned vehicles, and other similar equipment or some Air Force equipment. Only when they transmit information to you can you carry out precise strikes on the enemy. Previously, the Type 100 tank was also criticized by many people for its lightweight. At first, some people thought it was 40 tons. But in fact, if all the additional armor of the Type 100 tank is removed, the weight of the bare vehicle is only about 28 tons. Of course, its armor level can be improved, but no matter how much it is improved, the maximum tonnage limit of the Type 100 armored vehicle family is only more than 30 tons, less than 40 tons. Moreover, when we watched the 93 military parade this time, when mentioning the Type 100 armored vehicle family, including the introduction to the Army, the so-called global deployment was highly emphasized. The biggest problem of the previous Type 99 tank is that it cannot achieve global deployment, not to mention being deployed on the Qinghai Xizang Plateau. In fact, south of the Yangtze River, the Type 99 tank can hardly be used effectively because of its excessive weight. Because the maximum weight of the Type 100 tank can be controlled below 40 tons, even in the south, its usability is much stronger than that of the previous Type 99 tank series. Compared with Western tanks that often weigh 60 tons or even 70 tons, its deployability is much stronger than that of the previous mainstream third-generation tanks. Many people are also concerned about its protection capability because of its relatively light weight. So what is its protection capability actually like? In fact, the protection of the Type 100 tank is relatively good. Of course, considering its tonnage, if compared with Western tanks of 70 tons in terms of pure armor-piercing projectile confrontation, it is definitely inferior. However, based on domestic needs, its protection capability is not much worse than that of the original Type 99 tank. A major reason for this is that it adopts an unmanned turret, so that the armor can be completely concentrated on the protection of the crew. In fact, the Type 99 tank only has thick frontal armor, because traditional tanks are designed for armor-piercing projectile confrontation and always face the enemy with their fronts, so only their fronts are thick. For the Type 100 tank, without the weight of turret protection, its side armor is actually stronger than that of the Type 99 tank. Therefore, we can clearly see that both the Type 100 tank and the armored support vehicle are equipped with reactive armor on their sides. This armor plays a great role and has good defensive capabilities against both anti-tank missiles and RPG rocket launchers. Both vehicles are equipped with active protection systems, but if the enemy has enough anti-tank missiles or FPV drones, to be honest, they cannot withstand a saturation attack. In fact, the entire 4th generation tank series adopts non-contact combat. They do not emphasize engaging in close combat with the enemy on the front line. Moreover, regarding the Type 100 tank, people wonder whether it will be promoted throughout the Army in the future, or at least replace all Type 96 tanks. In fact, from the current perspective, we need to consider our actual threats. As for the neighboring countries bordering our country, there are actually no major land wars to fight. At most, tanks will be used when liberating a certain island in the southeast. If that island issue is resolved, then in fact, not many such tanks will be needed. Therefore, the current army is willing to spend money on situational awareness, such as purchasing drones or long-range rocket launchers, which may greatly improve the combat effectiveness of our army. In fact, compared with previous tanks, the entire Type 100 armored vehicle family is less about fighting alone, and more about relying on informationized warfare. This also includes the Type 100 armored support vehicle we saw this time. In fact, it is not an infantry fighting vehicle, but an intelligent combat vehicle. Compared with the 4th generation tank, its so-called support is more about supporting the situational awareness nodes on the battlefield, rather than directly supporting the tank. In fact, these two vehicles should complement each other. For example, if the unmanned vehicles supporting the 4th generation armored vehicle family are controlled by the 4th generation tank, it may be relatively inconvenient. But if they are controlled by the 4th generation support vehicle, the operating environment will be much better. During the 93 military parade this time, a photo of soldiers boarding the vehicle was exposed. From this photo, we can clearly see that when soldiers board the Type 100 armored support vehicle, they do not sit on one side of the vehicle. In this case, the vehicle can actually carry very few people at the back. Moreover, we can see that there are obvious power supply devices under the other side of the vehicle. In fact, the Type 100 support vehicle also adopts a modular design. There are even versions that do not carry infantry at the back. In fact, the back of such versions can be used to launch vertically launched loitering munitions or anti-tank missiles, and it actually has the capability to launch both. In fact, the support concept of the Type 100 support vehicle is different from that of the T-15 support vehicle developed by Russia on the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. In fact, the design concept of such Russian armored vehicles still only stays on further improving the performance of traditional tanks, and there is no essential difference in their combat concepts. Regarding this armored support vehicle, apart from the difference in artillery and a drone placed at the back compared with the Type 100 tank, many people see a device on it that looks very much like a radar. So many people say that the Type 100 support vehicle is specially used to shoot down drones. Personally, I don't think this is the case. From the current perspective, this device is more like a communication antenna. In fact, looking at the new drones currently used by the domestic army, in order to prevent communication signals from being easily intercepted by the enemy on the battlefield, the communication between the army and the drones actually adopts the phased array directional communication mode. This mode makes it more difficult for the enemy to detect the communication signals. Whether it is attacking the communication terminal or jamming the signal, the difficulty is much greater than that of the original broadcast communication. Therefore, I personally believe that the device at the back of the Type 100 support vehicle should also be a directional radio communication antenna. Moreover, if you look at the photos, compared with the original FK3000 and 625 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, the radars on them are terminal radars, and we can all see the size of those radars. For interception, it is better to intercept as far as possible rather than considering how close to intercept. Even if you use lasers, each laser shot can only target one object. It is not like what some people say that with multiple turrets or multiple laser output ports, you can deal with targets in several directions at the same time. In fact, this is not feasible. If you are under saturation attack, if conditions permit, you should carry out strikes at the source rather than eliminating the enemy's weapons after they are launched. For future land warfare, it can be said that if you lose the air battle, you will definitely lose the land battle. It is impossible to win the land battle after losing the air battle. Therefore, if you have air superiority, the enemy's army will not be able to resist you on an organizational basis. They can only enter the battlefield sporadically. For example, during the Normandy landing in World War II, which mainly relied on free-fall bombs and rockets, Germany could only launch counterattacks at the battalion level against the Allied forces on the Normandy beachhead. Now, with various drones in the sky, various sensors in the sky and on the ground, and the precision and range of strike munitions, it is even more difficult to fight on an organizational basis if air superiority is lost. Basically, when our army really enters the battlefield, the enemy's counterattacks can only be at the platoon level at most. I even think it may not reach the platoon level, maybe only the squad level. For armored vehicles, Western armies usually have a platoon of 4 vehicles. Even at most, it is 5 vehicles per platoon. So they themselves are unable to launch counterattacks against you on an organizational scale. Some people also say that if in urban combat, an enemy tank suddenly appears, can your tank defeat it? I used to have similar thoughts and asked experts about it. The experts said, first, it depends on the probability. Second, if that enemy tank fires at you, it will expose itself. In fact, no matter how good your armor protection is, if you are hit by a shell, your fire control system will basically fail. In this case, your tank will have no combat effectiveness. For the subsequent fire strikes, the enemy does not necessarily need to use tanks to attack you, because there are now more various means of attack, so there is no need for tank-to-tank confrontation as before. Moreover, the future use of the Type 100 tank or the armored vehicle family will be different from before. We all know that in the past, armored vehicles were put into the battlefield in battalion-level formations, with at least the same type of armored vehicles in an entire battalion. In fact, during the last military reform in our country, the integration had already reached the battalion level. That is, a combined battalion consists of 2 companies of tanks, 2 companies of infantry fighting vehicles, and 1 company of 120mm howitzers. For the Type 100 tank, its integration level will be higher. Moreover, when we watch the 93 military parade, comparing the Type 100 support vehicle with the Type 100 tank, except for the different positions of the engines in their chassis, the width of their road wheels and tracks seems to be the same. Therefore, the weight of these two vehicles may also be similar, and the versatility of their chassis is actually very high. Therefore, in the future, the integration level of the Type 100 armored vehicle family may reach the platoon level. In the future, its formation may consist of one tank and one support vehicle. Originally, a platoon had 4 tanks, but in the future, it may become 2 tanks and 1 or 2 support vehicles. Moreover, in fact, the 4th generation armored vehicle family is a family of vehicles, so it is very likely that there will be other configurations. For example, in the past, when infantry fighting vehicles supported tank operations, they mainly relied on infantry dismounting to cover the tanks on the battlefield. In fact, in the future, it is very likely that the next generation of so-called infantry fighting vehicles will carry various small armored vehicles at the back. The various small armored vehicles we saw in the 93 military parade may support the tanks, and this is very likely. In fact, including this time, there was a 105mm unmanned vehicle supporting the 4th generation armored vehicle family, but it was actually withdrawn from the exhibition in the end. This unmanned vehicle was originally designed to support the 4th generation armored vehicle family. In fact, in the future combined battalions or combined brigades, there will be a more advanced asset at the higher level drone swarms. I took photos of this at the Zhuhai Air Show. We can see that the command vehicle for the drone swarms is not a radar but a command antenna. Regarding how the Type 100 armored vehicle family deals with the enemy's drone swarms, in fact, both Russia and Ukraine often encounter various so-called drones on the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. As long as the troops launch an attack rashly, they will encounter various drones. In fact, neither Russia nor Ukraine has air superiority. For the Russian aerospace forces, the biggest problem is that they have too few types of aircraft now. Not the number, but the types. This results in their poor ability to collect and locate the enemy's electronic signals on the battlefield. Therefore, we also saw various strange-looking vehicles in the 93 military parade, which play roles in electronic jamming, electronic support, electronic reconnaissance, and electronic signal collection and analysis on the battlefield. Therefore, if you have both air superiority and electronic warfare superiority, it will be very difficult for the enemy to assemble various messy drones. Not to mention that the drone operators on the Russia-Ukraine battlefield are relatively unprofessional. Moreover, some people originally said that the gun on our Type 100 support vehicle is an anti-aircraft gun, but in fact it is a Fortum-M automatic cannon. Its characteristic is that it has relatively great firepower. The power of the Fortum cannon is almost close to that of the original 50mm ordinary shells. It has great support firepower, but in fact its rate of fire is quite ordinary. It is actually more effective in attacking the enemy's fortifications, bunkers, or positions. Its range can actually reach 5 to 7 kilometers, which is also a very big difference from our previous infantry fighting vehicles. Moreover, the closest concept of the original US armored vehicle family to ours is the FCS, Future Combat Systems concept back then. But from the current perspective, compared with the US, FCS, our vehicle family, has more types. A very important reason why the US FCS was terminated at that time is that the US also considered its battlefield environment. Because when using the 4th generation armored vehicle family to fight guerrillas, to be honest, its effect is not fundamentally different from that of the 3rd generation vehicle family. Moreover, the US also took into account that its future strategy has changed. The original US strategy from the 2000s to 2016, before Obama took office, was from the sea to the land. As we all know, in the later period of Obama's administration and after Trump took office, the US strategy has changed to return to the ocean. Since it has returned to the ocean, the role of the Army has actually decreased. Therefore, we can see that the US military's current Army equipment update is very slow, and it is not their priority. Because if the sea and air battles are lost, even if you have armored vehicles that are 1 generation ahead of the enemy, you still cannot fight against them. Because no matter what, your armored vehicles are still 2-dimensional targets. As we all know in the 3-body problem, 3-dimensional attacks on 2-dimensional targets are dimensionality reduction strikes, and 4-dimensional attacks on 3-dimensional targets are also dimensionality reduction strikes. This is a brief analysis of the differences between the exposed 4th generation armored vehicle family and the previous generations of tanks. This type of tank is based on future warfare. It is not based on the so-called urban combat, nor is it developed based on the experience of the Russia-Ukraine war.